there are kings and queens and politicians and, really important people like you and all kinds of people. Not everybody likes them. Ozzy is universally loved. He is beloved. He's a beloved figure, continues to be. People love Ozzy.
And he was just a regular guy. Yes, on stage, the Prince of Darkness, but a loving father, dedicated husband. Sharon and Ozzy have been together decades and decades.
And then the words hit him. Ozzy's dead. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He dropped the phone. It bounced softly on the hardwood floor. The sound felt loud in the empty room.
I'm dying. It's a fact. There's no need for a doctor to tell me. That farewell performance was something I insisted on doing. I don't want to disappear silently.
My first impression of Sabbath was a full-page ad in the back of Rolling Stone, and it said, Black Sabbath, louder than Led Zeppelin. And I went, oh yeah, that's the coolest of the cool. And
Gene sank into his chair, hands pressed to his face. Sunglasses still on. The world outside went on. Music played somewhere faintly on the radio. People went to work, took their kids to school, had coffee and meetings. But Gene was frozen. Time had stopped. He remembered the first time he met Ozzy. It was 1974. Kiss was a young band climbing out of New York's clubs. Black Sabbath was already a force. Touring fast and heavy through the U.S., Gene walked into a dim, smoke-filled hotel room. Ozzy was there first. Shirt ripped, hair a mess, barefoot, holding a bottle of whiskey and a cigarette. His eyes were wide and wild.
When you saw Ozzy running around on stage, you're thinking, this is somebody who should be committed. Just a crazy man and giving full. I've never read or saw a Sabbath show ever where you got the sense that Ozzy was just going through the paces. And
You look like a painted clown, Ozzy said. And you look like chaos itself, Gene replied, and they both laughed. That laugh was the star of bond that would survive decades of rock and roll insanity. Now, decades later, that chaos was gone, and Gene couldn't process it. He thought of all the times Ozzy had survived things no human should survive. The overdoses, the crashes, the stage mishaps, the hospital trips, the doctors who shook their heads and said, he's lucky to be alive. And Ozzy had always smiled through it, laughed through it, called his story for the ages. But this time, there would be no laughter.
People don't realize that Ozzy, though he didn't play an instrument, those are his melodies. That's him writing melodies and lyrics and crafting that sound, that enormous guitar that Iommi has that just, shook the heavens, the guitar that ruled the world. Ozzy, there never was one like him and probably never will be.
Gene picked up his phone again, called Sharon. He didn't speak much. Just, I can't believe he's gone. How do we go on? Sharon's voice, always still under fire, sounded fragile. We go on, Gene. He'd want us to. Gene hung up and stared at the photo. He thought about the balcony in New York, where Ozzy had climbed naked, arms spread, claiming he could fly. Gene had saved him from falling. He remembered the cops, the chaos, the laughter. He remembered thinking, this man is impossible. He can't die. And now he had. The grief hit him like a tidal wave. Not loud, not dramatic, just deep, quiet, crushing.
I just want to say my experiences, and I'm sure yours, meeting Ozzy face to face is like meeting your next door neighbor. Just a matter-of-fact guy, no airs, not pretending to be. I reluctantly admit that sometimes I'm full of myself. I'm aware of that. I watch myself in videos and I'm thinking, who does this guy think he is? Yes, guilty as charged. Ozzy, never. Oh, hi, Gene. Nice to see you and everything. And, all of a sudden you're disarmed and you're, maybe I should bring the level of kind of a big deal down.
Gene sank further into his chair. He whispered into the empty room, brother, you were impossible. And I loved every minute of it. He sat like that for hours, memories flooding in. Wild nights, backstage pranks, fights, laughter, chaos, fear, music, and madness. Every moment with Ozzy replayed, sharper than reality, more vivid than any photo. And for the first time in decades, Gene Simmons realized something terrifying. He was alone. The man who had survived everything had finally been taken. And Gene was left to carry the stories, the madness, the memories. Alone, the world would mourn a legend. Gene mourned a brother.
there are kings and queens and politicians and, really important people like you and all kinds of people. Not everybody likes them. Ozzy is universally loved. He is beloved. He's a beloved figure, continues to be. People love Ozzy. You may not even be a fan. You just are drawn to who Ozzy is.
Yeah.
He will continue. And I said this a few hours ago. My recommendation is that shut off all the noise, turn off TikTok and Schmickstock and all that other idiotic stuff. Turn off your TV, lock yourself in a room, and put on some Sabbath.
Touring with Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just wild, it was dangerous. Every night felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, watching a storm that could swallow you whole. Gene Simmons learned this fast. He knew Ozzy was fearless, maybe reckless, but he didn't understand just how much until that first near-death moment. One night in Miami, Gene walked into Ozzy's hotel room and froze. The room reeked of alcohol and cigarette smoke. Ozzy was collapsed on the floor, pale, barely breathing. A spilled bottle of pills lay next to him. For a heartbeat, Gene thought he had lost him. He grabbed Ozzy, shook him, yelled his name, and somehow, after what felt like an eternity, Ozzy's eyes fluttered open. And the first words out of his mouth, "Have I missed the encore?" Gene had never laughed so nervously in his life. Relief, fear, and all crashed over him all at once. That was Ozzy. Death couldn't touch him, or at least, he didn't want it to.
See, in another way, he reminded me of you, Gene, because, he was a great sort of man for stagecraft.
I couldn't shine his shoes.
Gene realized something then. To survive Ozzy, you had to accept chaos as part of life, not an interruption. There were more nights like that. Plane accidents, broken bones from stage stunts, overdoses. Yet every time, Ozzy came back, wilder, louder, impossible to tame. And Gene, he became the anchor, the man who could manage the storm without losing himself. This was where chaos met control. Gene was precise, calculating, focused on the empire of Kiss. He planned tours, finances, and deals down to the last detail. Ozzy, he thrived on anarchy. Every night, the unpredictable, the insane, the dangerous pushed Gene to his limits. And yet, Gene admired it, loved it, even. He learned to step back, let the hurricane pass, and sometimes dive in.
It's funny, Ozzy and I ran into each other at an event, and we were sitting with each other and talking, and he said this in public, but he said it to my face. I said, "So what do you think? What kind of music you like?" "Oh, I love the Beatles." And "Oh, yeah, me too. Who else?" "I love ABBA." "ABBA?"
Yes.
Yeah, without, the rest of us are all trying to pick the right things to say to bolster our public image. Ozzy didn't give a squat. He was Ozzy, and caution be damned. Take it or leave it. Maybe the Greeks...
Through all the madness, Gene realized something profound. Ozzy didn't just survive danger, he embraced it. And in that embrace, he taught Gene lessons no school, no manager, no contract ever could. Courage, recklessness, laughter in the face of fear, and loyalty to the end. When Ozzy finally passed, Gene felt the weight of all those lessons. He wasn't just mourning a rock star. He was mourning a brother who had shown him the limits of life, and how to laugh at them anyway.
And he was just a regular guy. Yes, on stage, the Prince of Darkness, but a loving father, dedicated husband. Sharon and Ozzy have been together decades and decades. Most people break up their families, especially men, and abandon their families. He was a stand-up guy who treated the Queen of England the way he'd treat next-door neighbor. Eh?
If Ozzy Osbourne was a storm, Sharon Osbourne was the anchor. Gene Simmons had always known her as a force of nature, sharp, fearless, and unflinching, but watching her work with Ozzy gave him a whole new level of awe. Ozzy's life was a tornado of chaos, danger, and madness. Overdoses, near-fatal accidents, on-stage mishaps, and backstage disasters were almost daily events. Yet Sharon stood in the middle of it all, steady, unyielding, like a rock carved from fire. Gene remembered one incident on tour in London. Ozzy had taken too much of something he shouldn't have, and his body was shutting down. Doctors were frantic. Sharon, calm but commanding, organized everything. She knew exactly what to do, called the right people, ordered treatment, and never panicked. And through it all, she kept Ozzy conscious, laughing, and alive. Gene couldn't help but admire her. He had spent decades in rock, running wild, surviving chaos. But Sharon had an almost supernatural ability to control the uncontrollable. Without her, Gene knew Ozzy wouldn't have made it through half the nights he survived. But admiration didn't mean simplicity. Gene also felt the tension that came with Sharon's presence. She wasn't just Ozzy's wife. She was his protector, his manager, his constant. And sometimes, Gene sensed her judging him. Not harshly, but the kind of look that said, "You can't control this chaos the way I do." He remembered an argument backstage in New York. Ozzy was being his usual wild self, doing something reckless that could have ended in disaster. Sharon stepped in, her voice cutting through the room like steel. Gene, usually calm in chaos, felt the tension rise. He respected her, but he also felt a spark of irritation. She had tamed the untamable, and sometimes that clashed with his instinct to watch and let chaos unfold. Yet, over the years, Gene realized something crucial. Sharon wasn't taming Ozzy for control or ego. She was saving him. And without her, Ozzy's story might have ended decades earlier. There were countless nights when Gene saw Sharon push herself to the edge, neglecting her own rest, arguing with doctors, negotiating contracts, calming Ozzy when he lashed out. And still, she smiled, laughed, and fought every single time. Gene couldn't say it aloud, but he felt a deep, complicated respect. Admiration mixed with awe. Sometimes frustration. Always gratitude. Because in the middle of madness, Ozzy survived not just through luck or his own reckless brilliance, but through Sharon. Gene remembered whispering to himself after one particularly harrowing night, "She's impossible just like him, and somehow she's keeping him alive." The years rolled on. Gene, Sharon, and Ozzy became an unspoken team. Each had their role. Gene watched, protected in his own way. Sharon managed, healed, controlled. And Ozzy? He lived, laughed, and terrified the world, surviving chaos with a grin and a bottle in hand. When Ozzy finally passed, Gene realized something. The world mourned the Prince of Darkness. But Gene mourned the brother he had lost, the man who had survived everything, and the woman who had kept him alive all those years. Sharon's strength was monumental, and Gene's respect? Absolute.
Would you like some, biscuits and some tea? He treated everybody the same. He had an enormous personality. He would walk in a room. By the way, I spoke with somebody recently, and he was doing an interview with Ozzy, and as Ozzy was coming down the hallway, it was a radio station, he had his arms open like this, as if it was a family member, and he never even met the guy.
Gene Simmons had spent decades watching Ozzy Osbourne live life on the edge. But when Ozzy died, all those memories came rushing back in vivid, unstoppable waves. He remembered the hotel room in Chicago where Ozzy had taken over the entire floor, stacking furniture in impossible towers, laughing as security ran around trying to stop him. Gene had sat in the corner, shaking his head, part terrified, part in awe. He remembered the tour bus in Detroit, where Ozzy convinced everyone to dye their hair neon colors in the middle of the night. Gene, always meticulous about appearances, had ended up bright green from head to toe. Ozzy had laughed so hard, he nearly fell off his bunk. There was a night in Los Angeles when Ozzy smuggled a live band into the arena, convinced it was part of the show. People screamed, the crowd went wild, and Gene realized again how impossible it was to predict what Ozzy would do next. Through all the madness, Gene never stopped watching, never stopped learning. Ozzy was reckless, yes, but he was fearless, and there was a method to his madness, if you could call it that. But none of those stories could prepare Gene for this. When the news came that Ozzy was gone, grief hit him like a tidal wave. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, crushing. Every memory, every laugh, every moment of chaos replayed in his mind like a film that wouldn't stop. He sat alone for hours, sometimes days, staring at photos, videos, and old backstage passes. He whispered to himself, "Brother, you were impossible." And I loved every minute of it. Gene realized how much he relied on Ozzy, not just for friendship, but for understanding what it meant to survive chaos, to thrive in madness, to live fully. Ozzy had been fearless. Ozzy had been untouchable. And now he was gone. The grief wasn't just about loss. It was about remembering everything that had shaped him. Every tour, every prank, every near-death experience. And for Gene, the realization was terrifying. The world would go on, but his brother in chaos would not. Gene knew he had to honor Ozzy.
And sorry if I stumble here, because, it hit me like a ton of bricks. The way it hit all Ozzy fans, just devastating, because you'd like to think the bad guys die young. Ozzy was a pure soul, never hurt anybody, and, was there on stage creating, this amazing spectacle. So we happen to have been going to the same movie theater, my family and Ozzy's family. They're in front. And he turns around and says, "Oh, Gene, how are you?" Ozzy, hey, what's going on? So we greet each other. So you'd think, so what was the recent tour? What was the gross? How many? None of that. How's the family? How are the kids? You know, it was people talk. And that's the main thing about Ozzy. Yes, the Prince of Darkness. Also, he had a heart of gold.
Not with loud speeches or public statements, but with truth, with memories, with confessions that showed the world who Ozzy really was. Wild, fearless, human, unstoppable. He called Sharon, sharing his stories, his grief, his admiration. He wanted to make sure the world understood the full picture. The laughs, the chaos, the dangers, and the love. At the funeral, Gene didn't play a role. He didn't hide behind a demon mask. He was just Gene, a man who had lost a brother, a partner in madness, a lifelong friend. He spoke quietly, emotionally. He told the crowd about the balcony in New York, the bats in Los Angeles, the late nights that blurred into mornings filled with laughter. He told them about Ozzy's courage, his recklessness, his ability to survive the impossible. When he finished, Gene placed his hand on the coffin, his eyes glistening behind his sunglasses. He whispered, "Brother, save me a stage up there. We'll make heaven scream like we did the world." The room was silent. Sharon broke down. Kelly cried. Jack looked away. And Gene Simmons walked away, holding every wild, terrifying, beautiful memory in his heart. Ozzy Osbourne was gone. But in Gene's mind, in his stories, in his grief and laughter, Ozzy would never truly die.
Here he is being paid tribute, along with Sabbath, by the biggest bands on the planet, Metallica and everybody else. And he's supposed to be this dark figure and all that. And you can see his heart pumping, and he goes to everybody, "I love you," to the fans, and blowing kisses. What kind of thing is that for the Prince of Darkness to do? Actually, that's the real Ozzy.
Ozzy Osbourne was gone, but his influence was everywhere. Every riff, every scream, every insane moment that terrified and delighted fans. Ozzy left a mark that would never fade. Gene Simmons reflected on the years they had shared. He had learned so much from Ozzy. The courage to take risks, the audacity to laugh at fear, the beauty of chaos. Ozzy hadn't just survived life. He had thrived in it. Every mistake, every disaster, every laugh-filled night was a lesson in living without regrets. Gene often said that Ozzy's life was like a hurricane, wild, uncontrollable, and utterly unforgettable. And now that hurricane was gone, leaving a silence that was almost unbearable. He remembered telling Sharon he wasn't just a rock star, he was a force of nature, and we were lucky to witness it. Gene also thought about the younger generations of musicians, the kids picking up guitars, screaming into microphones, thinking they could be wild and untouchable. Ozzy had shown them how to do it for real, how to survive chaos, to laugh at danger, and still rise every time. And Gene realized that was a true legacy, not the albums, not the concerts, not the headlines. The legacy was the madness, the courage, the laughter, the human chaos that made everyone feel alive. The funeral was over. The crowd had gone. The cameras had left. The world had mourned, but now the moment was private. Gene Simmons stood by the coffin one last time. No mask, no showmanship, just a man saying goodbye to the brother he had lost. He whispered, "Brother, you were impossible. You scared me. You made me laugh. You made me feel alive. And I will miss you every second." He looked at Sharon, Kelly, Jack, saw their grief, their strength, their love. He realized that in losing Ozzy, they had all lost something irreplaceable. Gene took a deep breath and touched the coffin gently, feeling the weight of decades of madness, laughter, chaos, and music. "Save me a stage up there," he whispered. "We'll make heaven scream together." And with that, he stepped back, shoulders heavy, eyes wet, heart full. Ozzy Osbourne's body was gone. But in Gene's memories and his stories, in every wild, impossible moment, Ozzy would live forever. Because legends like him don't die. They just keep haunting the hearts of those who love them, laugh with them, and survived alongside them.